Hello everybody, today we welcome back Thomas Peaple to talk to us in a bit of a follow-up from the Homer video about another writer on the Trojan War. This time the Roman writer, Virgil. So let's go meet him. Hello Thomas Peaple, welcome back to the show.
Welcome.
So, just to begin, who was Virgil?
Virgil, if we're putting it simply, was a Roman poet living in the end of the Republic and into the reign of Augustus. He was a very interesting man in some ways. He was a poet. He inspired a lot of legends, a lot of story about him continues. I'm avoiding calling him a propaganda poet for Augustus because he may have been some of the time, but he did have other works too.
So, what was the Aeneid and how does it link to the Iliad and the Odyssey?
The Aeneid is a poem written by Virgil. It's an epic poem. It's one of 3 extant poems we have of his as of this moment. Sorry, but you never know with ancient poets whether someone's going to suddenly discover another word that we never knew about. But there are 3 works of his that we have. The Aeneid is the 3rd and final. As far as I know, there aren't any other works that we know existed but are now lost, so it's not like with some of these writers you have other works we know existed once but have now been lost. I believe we don't have any that are lost. The story of the Aeneid is the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince, who eventually in the story founds Rome. It basically, to give a very quick summary, is as follows. It starts with him leaving Troy. He goes to Carthage where he meets Queen Dido. Through flashbacks we discover that the Trojan horse trick destroyed Troy and he was forced to flee with his family, but sadly lost his wife during the run. After the flashbacks end, he falls in love with Queen Dido, but is persuaded that it is his duty to go to Rome. So he heads to Rome, or what will become Rome. He tries to become engaged to a princess of the Italian people he's trying to work with, but she's already been betrothed to a man called Turnus. So as a result there is a war between the Trojans and the local Italians. Aeneas is eventually victorious, and the poem ends with the death of Turnus. As they say, more on that story later. The link to the Iliad and the Odyssey. It is partly its structure. The first 6 books are done as a journey in the style of the Odyssey. The second 6 books are basically a long battle, a bit like the Iliad. To clarify, by the way, they're called books. It's a bit of an old expression. It'd be a bit, I suppose in the modern sense they're close to what we might call chapters, but they'd be very long chapters if they were. So these 12 books or chapters of the Aeneid have been discovered, and then the story I've just mentioned is basically it. But as I say, aside from the 6 and 6 split, there's also various thematic things. So the main character goes to the underworld, and in both the Odyssey and the Aeneid, then meets a man he didn't know was dead, who then reveals he's been killed, and how he died. Both have flashbacks. The Iliad and the Aeneid both have a fight that's briefly delayed and then happens. There are an awful lot of parallels between the two. The related mythology is that they both depict the Trojan War, although more from a Trojan perspective, and some characters appear or are mentioned in both.
So, just to clarify, does Virgil reposition the Trojan War story into the Trojan perspective?
Well, there are some sections of the Iliad. Don't think there's any in the Odyssey, but there are some sections of the Iliad that are told from the point of view of the Trojans, so not in that sense. However, the fact that the main character of the Trojan and his adventures after the fall of Troy are the main bits is notable. It's also notable that sometimes things that are thought of as Homeric are in fact Virgil. Probably most famously the line that I'm afraid I can't give an accurate rendition of, so I will use the common translation. I fear the Greeks even when they bring me gifts. That actually comes from the Aeneid, not anything by Homer. The other thing to bear in mind, I would say, in terms of repositioning, is that there's a section in the Aeneid, I forget which book it's in, but basically there's a section where the people who find the Trojans are given a report and they're basically told Aeneas, he was the best Trojan in the war, he was the most difficult, if there'd been more Trojans like him, we'd have probably lost the war. Oh, and Hector was pretty good as well. Now, in the Iliad, by Homer, Aeneas is a very minor figure and Hector is very much the main Trojan threat to the Greek cause, so it is somewhat inverted, shall we say, in saying, oh yeah, Aeneas was the best Trojan and Hector helped.
So, how does the Aeneid form part of the Roman foundational myth?
Well, firstly because Aeneas' descendants are supposedly people like Romulus and Remus. He also has a son who we find out will be born later, the son of Aeneas, who is also going to be the son of an Italian woman called Lavinia. So Aeneas and Lavinia will produce offspring who will eventually, or across the generations, as I say, will include people like Romulus and Remus and Augustus. There's a scene where Aeneas is down in the underworld and he's shown a load of people waiting to be born, starting with heroes like Romulus and going into people like Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. So it very much is this sort of, this man will be the beginning of the dynasty that will eventually include the first king of Rome. And by the way, the man who's now the, I forget it, because we don't know exactly when it was written, his title, the old title Augustus had changed at times, but the man who would become things like first citizen, in all but name the first emperor of Rome.
So, just tying into that last point, was the Aeneid used to bolster Augustus's legitimacy as ruler of Rome?
Well, claiming he was a descendant of people as important as Romulus or Aeneas would certainly bolster his image. There are two particular scenes that show the future from a pro-Augustus perspective. As I've already mentioned, the procession of descendants in the underworld. The other one is in book 8 of the Aeneid. Aeneas is given this wonderful shield, and the main point is it's meant to protect him, but it has various images of it, on it, which include things like the dangerous, seductive Cleopatra, and basically portrays her as evil. It's one of the pieces of Augustan literature that is probably responsible for the common image of Cleopatra as some kind of beautiful seductress, when in fact it's probably more likely that she was a lot plainer, and the thing that most interested Mark Antony about her was her money. But the Aeneid is an example of how Augustus created this mythology of Cleopatra as beautiful and driving men to do stupid things with her amazing beauty. So, yeah, you get the shield of Aeneas that depicts essentially the enemies of of Augustus in a negative light. So in many ways it bolstered the image of Augustus.
Why is the ending controversial?
Right. Throughout the poem there is a very collective theme of don't give in to your emotions, do the most rational, best thing, and very crucially think about the wider implications. Don't do what's good for you if it isn't good for everyone. Now, Aeneas often struggles with this concept, And I should also point out there is a scene, I think it's the underworld scene, where Aeneas is told that his people should forgive those who submit and war down the proud. In other words, fight people who won't accept, who won't comply, but when they do comply, show mercy. Now, Aeneas often struggles with a lot of these concepts. As I mentioned before, he has to be persuaded not to just stay in Carthage and marry Queen Dido instead of doing what he needs to do and go to Italy. Whilst fleeing Troy, there's a scene where he's about to go back to his family to get them safely out of Troy, but then sees Helen and basically goes, "Oh, forget my family for a minute, let's kill Helen," which will satisfy nothing except his anger, and therefore it's a very bad idea, but it shows where his priorities are, and his own mother Venus has to jump in and say, "No, it's not Helen's fault, not necessary, go back and protect your family." So there have been various incidents throughout the poem where one might question Aeneas' ability to live to the ideals Romans are meant to espouse to. However, the very end of the Aeneid still left many people over the years perplexed. Because basically he's defeated Turnus, Turnus does what he's supposed to do, he submits, he accepts that Aeneas will marry Lavinia, he's going to give up his claim, all's fine. And Aeneas is about to agree and give it and basically let him live, but obviously with some kind of treaty where he has to accept Aeneas as won. But then he sees a belt on Turnus, which basically he took from someone that Turnus killed after Aeneas had promised to protect. So basically, feeling upset at being reminded of this person he failed to protect, he takes out on Turnus and in a fit of rage kills him. So basically Aeneas completely fails to live up to the ideals he was meant to espouse by just killing his enemy in a fit of rage. And the point is, the way it's written is very confusing, because obviously he could have had Aeneas reluctantly kill Turnus because he realises there'll only be peace if he's dead, so he could have killed him and done the right thing, quote unquote, the thing that's necessary for the future of his people, but no, he kills him in a fit of blind rage. In fact, there was a book a couple of decades ago now, called Lavinia by Ursula Le Guin, which was quite interesting in the way it tried to sort of whitewash Aeneas' behaviour and make excuses for him, and that's because so many people find the concept of Aeneas killing someone in a fit of rage absolutely diabolical and contrary to what a hero is. I should quickly address the elephant in the room here. There are some who argue that that's because the Aeneid isn't finished. There are a tiny minority who argue there were meant to be more books, so there were meant to be, say, 15 books of the Aeneid, and a bigger but still minority who argue that, okay, this was the last book, but perhaps there were meant to be another 20 lines to make it clear what we're meant to think of Aeneas. But a lot of the reason that exists is because so many people hate this ending and are sort of like, well, maybe it wasn't as Virgil intended, simply because they don't want to believe he would have wanted to end it like this. So I think that's why it's controversial.
Just to round things off for us, what would be the best approach for a modern reader to take with the Aeneid?
It really depends on whether they're looking from a literature or history perspective. If they're approaching it as a student of literature, then it's a very interesting epic poem. There are many people, to include myself, who think that the second half becomes something of a drag. But nonetheless, there are various events in it, there's some very interesting poetry, some very interesting characters. If one is trying to see it from a historical perspective, then I think the decision anyone reading it from that moment has to make is, what is it telling us about Augustus? As I mentioned, Aeneid himself often fails to live up to the ideals Romans are supposed to do. So you could possibly wonder if there's some very subtle dig at Augustus' family. You know, you were founded by a man like this. But others argue, no. The whole point is Aeneas may fail to live up to these values. His descendants will embody them. So, I think if one is looking from a historical perspective, because I believe there's very little evidence for the time it was written about, and at the end of the day, Virgil was 800 years after the fact, the main historical interests would have to be, what does it tell us about how Virgil wanted us to think about Augustus?
Thank you very much for joining us on the programme, and hope you have a pleasant day going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Thomas Peaple for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the video as well, and it was lovely having you here.